Okay, this video is going to discuss plagiarism, both what it is, how different types of plagiarism, and how to avoid it. This video is intended for my English 101 students, but 102 students, you could certainly watch this as well. So what I'm going to do is pull up on the screen the handout that I would be using in class, and I will go over it as I would in class. So this handout will be available on Blackboard, so you can read any of this. You can look at it while you're watching the video, or you can just watch the video. So to discuss plagiarism and to get started, I just pulled up a definition of it. It helps to know what it is, to understand what we should do and not do. So according to dictionary.com, just a standard online dictionary, plagiarism is, quote, the unauthorized use or close imitation of the language and thoughts of another author and the representation of them as one's own original work, as by not crediting the author. And then this would be, I've cited it to avoid plagiarism, and I also included the works cited entry here. I find that many students have never been taught much about plagiarism, that the habit has been in the past to not acknowledge sources at all, or including a link at the bottom of an essay is enough. In college level writing, particularly in English, plagiarism is taken very seriously, and I'll talk a little bit about the penalties later, but understanding just what it is I think a big part of it, and I find that many students have never been taught that. So that's why I wanted to start with the definition, and in this next section, as I say, I want to break down that definition, and I've highlighted some key portions. So one thing to be aware of, and that's the first bullet here, is that you can plagiarize even when the words are not exactly the same as the original. So the definition says it could be the close imitation of the original. So this is a good example of this would be you copied over a source and you did go in and change a few words, and some people will call this paraphrasing, even though it's really not, but just changing a word here and there, taking off the beginning of a sentence but keeping it pretty much the same. If you don't give credit and you don't cite the parts that are the exact wording, that is plagiarism. You're using someone else's words without giving them credit through the citation, or without acknowledging that they're their words with quotation marks. So that's one thing to pay attention to here, is it doesn't have to be the exact words. Related to that is, even if you change the words entirely, so you're really only using the author's idea, or you use a date, which you can't put in your own words. 1973 is 1973. But if you don't give credit where you got that information, that you looked it up, that you verified it in a textbook or on a website or wherever you got it from, that's what the second bullet is here. Even if the words are completely different, if you got the material, the information from somewhere else, it should be cited. Then, all of this, and I've kind of hinted at this, but the whole notion of plagiarism is not about using sources. College writing is about using sources, especially the further you move up in your college career. What plagiarism is when those sources are used, either exact wording or the idea, as we've already talked about, but the credit is not given. So acknowledging where those words came from, who said it first, what website you got it from, what essay you got it out of. Or even if it's just the idea, again, not acknowledging that that was not my original idea. I got that information from some outside source. Even if that outside source didn't have an author. Sometimes we think that, well, if there wasn't a specific person named, I don't have to give credit. That if it's on the internet, it belongs to everyone. And the reality is that no matter where it comes from, if it's not yours, a good rule to follow is that it should be cited. So that's just some basics of what it is. Now, talking about, as I say here, the types of plagiarism and the penalties. Now, every instructor does not distinguish between types of plagiarism. I do, and that's why I wanted to go over it. Now, they're both serious, but in terms of penalties, one is more severe than the other. So the first one, as I number it here, is called, or what I call, failure to master. So as I explained here, this is when I read an essay and there is some attempt by the student to give credit. So usually this means they have quoted some, they've acknowledged where it wasn't their words, there's probably some citations, But they're not consistent. So maybe they left off a citation in one place, or the citations are not exactly accurate, or that sort of thing. And how you interpret this failure to master is you are trying to do it, but you haven't mastered it completely. Now, again, this is not something to take lightly. If this happens, you'll have to, depending on how severe it is, if it's just once or twice maybe in an essay, then I may just lower the grade. If it's a pattern throughout the essay, but I still feel like this is not you or a student trying to cheat, but is simply a lack of understanding of how to do it, or again, failure to do it correctly, I have asked students many times to redo the essay. Typically come into the office, we'll go over a few examples one-on-one to show you how to correct them, and then I'll expect you to redo the essay before I grade it. And if it's not corrected, then the grade will suffer. So that's what I call failure to master. This is, again, something you don't want to do, but it's very different from the second type, which I call intent to deceive. And exactly as it sounds, it is an intent to deceive me or your reader about where information came from. So when I call something intent to deceive, this means that it's a pretty blatant cheating, meaning it happens a lot in the essay. There is very little attempt to try to acknowledge where stuff comes from. I get the impression that, this was, again, an attempt to get out of doing work, to get out of acknowledging where information came from. And this typically is bigger passages in the essay. It's not a sentence here and there. It's typically from multiple locations or a lot from one location, and usually full sentences, paragraphs, and that sort of thing. If the plagiarism is what I would call intent to deceive, what's going to happen, and this is outlined in the syllabus, is it will be a 0 on the assignment. So if this is a final draft, that means 20% of the grade is now a 0 for the course. This is not something that can be rewritten. So, you slap together a draft at the last minute, copy and paste a bunch of stuff from some websites, don't cite it properly or don't cite it at all. Final draft ends up being a 0. That 0 is going to stand. So whatever impact that has on your overall grade is the impact it has. For most people, it means they end up failing the course or getting a much, much lower grade than what they would have had they not plagiarized. So I have a chart here that gives you in more specific terms what the difference is usually between this failure to master and intent to deceive. So what I consider pretty clear cut that a student is intending to deceive, intending to cheat or plagiarize, is something like downloading a paper, even purchasing a paper, or using someone else's paper and just putting your name on it. Someone who took 101 in the past and you're using their paper. That kind of thing. Again, it's going to be a 0 on the assignment, whatever it is. As I mentioned earlier, when it's, passages and full sentences and lots of stuff copied and pasted directly from a source, whether that's an essay in your book or a website, and citation is not given, credit is not given, this would be what I would call intent to deceive. And then obviously something like hiring someone else to write your paper, which is kind of similar to the first one there on that list. So this is obviously something you want to avoid doing. It's not worth it. The grade penalty is a very severe penalty, one that most people cannot recover from very well. So this is not a good idea. I know how tempting it can be when you're procrastinating at the last minute, but you always have other options when it comes to plagiarism. I apologize for that pop-up. The other stuff that I would consider, as I call it here, kind of a gray area, where it may be failure to master, it may be intent to deceive, would be when it's what I call a too close paraphrase. So you have changed some of the wording, but it's pretty similar to the original, and there's not consistent or clear credit given. And then again, when your citations are there, but there's really very little attempt to do them correctly, it's really inconsistent, and that sort of thing. From a standpoint of a teacher, I will say that I hate making the determination of which one it is, if it's intent to deceive or failure to master. The issue is that I don't want to punish someone unfairly if it's a genuine mistake. On the other hand, if someone is trying to deceive and is trying to plagiarize and is not taking it seriously, then they need to be punished because they need to understand the seriousness of what they're doing. In academic settings, plagiarism is a very big deal, especially in English, because English is all about words and all about ideas. So giving credit for those is very important. This is the kind of thing, depending on the school that you go to, the university or college you go to, that can follow you around. I want to prepare you for that because you never know when you walk into a classroom how an instructor feels about plagiarism. Are they going to cut you any slack? Are they going to consider any small act of plagiarism something that is going to give you a 0? And you don't ever know that usually. And if you transfer to somewhere else, they're going to assume you know this. And you saying, well, I didn't know or I forgot is probably not going to go very far. I can give you an example of how it worked at UK. I can't speak for every other institution, but just to show you how serious this could be. When I was working there, if you were charged with plagiarism and it was considered an academic offense, you would either get a 0 on the assignment or fail the entire class, depending on how severe it was, and an X would go on your transcript. Even if you didn't fail the class, it would go on your transcript that you had plagiarism. And there would be a notation of what the X was for, that it was for an academic offense, academic dishonesty. So, if you tried to transfer or something and you had that on your transcript, they would see that you had done this. If you did it more than once, so let's say you did it as a freshman and then you tried it again as a sophomore or junior, you could be expelled from the university for a time. So this is the kind of thing that whether you think it's right or agree with it, it is the kind of thing that can really transform and change your entire academic career and then your career plans if it involves getting a degree, if you don't take it seriously. So I do want you to be aware that these are guidelines you're going to have to follow and to take them very seriously. So most people can avoid plagiarism really easily. The obvious stuff like downloading and buying papers and copying and pasting stuff, other than telling you not to do it and penalizing you when you do it, there's not much I can do. Most students plagiarize by accident, and that I can help you with. So the steps to avoid getting into a plagiaristic situation is the source steps that we have talked about in class. So every time you use something from a source, whether this is your textbook, a website, a dictionary, anything, right? You should introduce it with a clear signal phrase. That's step 1. So this is where you say, according to Barbara Ehrenreich, according to dictionary.com, according to, the name of your history textbook. Give us a heads up that you're getting ready to use a source. Whatever you use as exact words, whether it's a full sentence or just a few words of a phrase, always put it in quotation marks. Whether it's paraphrased or quoted, you want to follow the material. So if it's a sentence, if it's a couple of sentences together, quoted or paraphrased, you want to follow it with a citation. Now for what is out of your book, as we've talked about, it will either be the author's last name and the page number or just the page number, if you've mentioned the author up here in step 1. If you are using something outside your book at this point in the semester, you should be seeing me about how to cite it. I would prefer you not use any outside sources right now, but if you do, ask instead of plagiarizing, right? But you always cite it wherever it came from. So those 3 steps will help you avoid, accidentally plagiarizing if you always give credit. Now, the last, number 4 and 5, are kind of general advice. One is just go with this policy of being really honest and transparent about your work. I would much rather you put in citations when you don't need them. This is what I mean by oversight. Than leave them out because you don't think you need them. If you don't need it, I'll mark it out. It's a correction, but it's not as big of a deal as not including a citation when you should. And again, just try to be really open and honest about where you get information. People get into trouble when they start hiding things. Either they feel like they've used too many sources or they're ashamed that they didn't know something, and so they don't give credit, and then it's a snowball effect, and it ends up creating this cloud of suspicion. The last step I've already covered, but I want to emphasize this, and this is what I will end this video with. When you are unsure how to handle a source, ask for help. As I say here, you saying I didn't know how to cite it is not an excuse to plagiarize. You can email me, you can come by. There are so many options that you have before plagiarizing. Typically, students plagiarize when they panic because they have procrastinated. Again, at that moment when you're tempted to plagiarize something, you have options. You can email me for help. You can come by and talk to me. You can ask for an extension. You can turn it in late. Even if you turned it in an essay late, you're going to lose 10 points if it's a day late. If you turn it in on time, but it's plagiarized, you're going to get a 0. So mathematically, it doesn't make any sense to take this risk. So realize that you have these options. Again, I understand this is something that many of you have never had to deal with before. You've never had to account for where you got your information. So I understand there's going to be bumps along the way, that you're not going to know how to handle everything. That's why you always ask when you're unsure. And that's why at this point, I would recommend you limit, if not eliminate, any outside sources so that all you have to work with is your book, which we've gone over how to cite, and your own ideas. And then in the next unit, when we're doing more of our outside research, you'll have more experience with how to handle it. So this is the handout that I will put on Blackboard about defining plagiarism and these guides, so you can always access this at any point. I'm going to end this video now. I'm going to record another lesson that will go over an example of plagiarism, so you'll need to watch it as well. But I don't want this video to get too long, so I'm going to end this video about plagiarism now, and you can email me with any questions.